Hello, everyone. It's been 1 week since the recording of part one. Jordan and Carl here will do essentially a cold open. They'll speed run some of the main arguments back from part one to catch us up, to catalyze the conversation about design, architecture, culture of Quai Network in part two. And Jordan, I will pass it over to you to begin the cold open. Thanks, guys.
All right. So to recapitulate at least some portion of the last 2.5 hours, we talked about the notion that there is plausibly a through line in the very, very big picture macro dynamics of the cosmos from Big Bang to blockchain that shows a series of transitions, for example, from physics to chemistry and chemistry to biology and biology to neurology and neurology to culture, that each transition state presents a series of somewhat similar problems, and that we are currently sitting in a highly unstable context. The solution to being able to scale human coordination well beyond the Dunbar limit that we call civilization that we developed has no stability. It's not built upon a strong enough underlying foundation. It has not yet constructed the binding agent, the ATP equivalent, the neuron equivalent that it needs to have to be able to be a stable piece of the arc. And so we then talked about, for example, a set of problems that are looming, relatively present. So we had the problem of the descent into chaos as the current political, geopolitical, financial, economic control structure begins to spin out of control, as every such version has done in the history of civilization, or the mirror image of that, which is the instantiation of increasingly sophisticated technologies of control, so the descent into tyranny, and noticing, by the way, that these two forces tend to relate to each other. More tyranny causes more people to react in an entirely adversarial fashion, which accelerates chaos. More chaos causes more people to react in a fearful fashion, desiring for control, which accelerates tyranny, and you start forcing something along both lines. But orthogonally, but participating in that, is the rise of AI and the fact that we seem to be participating in something that looks like the singularity curve. Acceleration is going according to plan, and that what things look like on the other side of that is well outside of the scope of our current capacity to govern. And that's important, by the way. Anybody who's endeavoring to articulate solutions to the AI problem from within a capacity to govern that is inadequate to actually ideate or execute on those solutions is definitely wasting everybody's time. And then the last, by the way, was mentioning large-scale objective events, like, let's say, the imminent polar reversal and the increasing likelihood of a Carrington-like event that would impact a global civilization which is increasingly dependent upon sensitive electronics, right? So you've got 2 or 3 vectors that are all converging to increase the probability of a major event, which is also outside the current cybernetic capacity of what we're operating with. The point being, and this is, I think, the key insight, that in order to address any problem that is beyond the capacity of a single human beings develop the ability to coordinate multiple humans together to form a synthetic agent that has a much higher level of capacity. Sometimes this has been called collective intelligence or effective collective intelligence. So a team of 12 doesn't just have the sum of 12 people. It has something geometric on top of 12 in terms of the ability to perceive problems, different perspectives, different backgrounds, the ability to make sense of what's happening, different intuitions, different heuristics, the ability to design solutions, and the ability to execute on those solutions if those people are able to coordinate properly. And obviously, we're now talking about problems that are extremely large in complexity and in intensity and in novelty. And the proposition is that our existing forms of collective intelligence, things like the nation state or the corporation or the NGO, are structurally incapable of actually addressing problems of this kind. It's just, they're not fast enough, they're not smart enough, and they're not able to prevent corruption and defection adequately to be able to address the problem category. And so we are forced to recognize that sine qua non, the absolute minimum, is we have to be thinking about a set of designs, a set of architectures, and a set of cultural constructs that produce a form of collective intelligence that is adequate to the problems that we're facing. And this is not it's a geometric argument. This is an argument of completion. We also then talked about how perhaps to many people it's odd or paradoxical that things like the form of money that you are using are extremely determinant of the way that your coordination structure ultimately develops over time. So a gold-based form of money produces certain capabilities. A fiat form of money produces certain capabilities, which unfortunately have a little bit of a Rochambeau advantage over gold, but have their own then near-term death baked in. And so we then end up at this conversation, which is, okay, if we're going to be forming something like a very large-scale coordination structure, and we recognize that a form of money is perhaps the cornerstone or the central element that needs to be thought through well, what does a properly designed form of money need to look like in order to be able to provide the central elements around which other elements will likely have to be produced to form the collective intelligence that can then scale up and begin to address the set of problems that we're looking at. So I think that's the problem statement that we're facing. And my understanding is that something like this was the inquiry that got you directly into Quai, particularly when looking at the degree to which the Bitcoin design and architecture, and perhaps, by the way, culture, although I'm just guessing that, was inadequate.
So it is Bitcoin that sort of inspired it for sure. And, I think Bitcoin was a good step in the right direction, right? We have to give Bitcoin its due for sure, right? It introduced proof of work, which created a coordination mechanism that no single party could control, which was a very important step. The original white paper was actually entitled, peer-to-peer electronic cash. And that's really what got me drawn into working and dedicating time to crypto, because under that sort of aspirational title is the idea of separating money from the state, and with proof of work, ideally making a money that has a much higher fidelity, meaning it can't be manipulated by political whim or central bankers, right? And with that, and I've actually thought deeply about money even, and sort of the morality of the whole thing and the necessity of it, to be perfectly frank. And when you look at society and you look at specialization isn't a bad thing, because with specialization, you get an aggregate increase in everybody's standard of living, right? And as you want to keep increasing everybody's standard of living, which I think is a fine goal, you're going to need that money system abstractly. So, I think the society that we built in having specialization is a perfectly sort of good outcome of coordinating groups. The problem, we face, is that the money system is inadequate as that information layer to communicate effectively and coordinate effectively, because it's sort of eroded as we've moved off of the gold standard to something that's just so far removed from the underlying reality that it's no longer a good information system. And so then a lot of the outcomes in our society, if you trace them back, they all trace back to the money. You can look at depending on what piece of society you want to disagree with, but you could look at monocracy crop agriculture and the use of glyphosate, you can actually trace that back to crop subsidies. But the reason crop subsidies can exist is because the dollar can exist and it can arbitrarily be printed through inflation. So if you didn't have, if you had a form of sound money, you probably wouldn't have crop subsidies. If you didn't have crop subsidies, you probably wouldn't have monocrop agriculture. If you didn't have monocrop agriculture, you probably wouldn't have glyphosate, right? So you can take many of these things in society that we see and like observe as these maladapted outcomes, and draw pretty straight lines to the corruption of money. And so Bitcoin as an idea and as a culture, I think, was initially entirely correct. I think it was this very open system of inquiry that anybody could contribute and try to be involved in or try to improve. Unfortunately, over time, that changed and it became a little bit more like a cult or a religion. And I think it lost sight of the original vision that was laid out of electronic peer-to-peer cash. And with the sort of aspirational concept of electronic peer-to-peer cash, what we kind of found as a crypto community, a Bitcoin community that evolved into a crypto community, is that Bitcoin was missing certain features that were kind of required to really sort of achieve that. Principally, you have the one of throughput, right? Bitcoin only does 5 transactions per second, but if we look at cash and credit, you need hundreds of thousands of transactions per second to function as money globally. There's the issues of just the settlement time, right? When we look at card-based transactions, you get confirmations in 5 seconds. And with Bitcoin, you can statistically get a confirmation in 10 minutes. Sometimes it can take up to 2 hours to actually go 6 blocks deep, which is considered finalization. So, it was inadequate from a perspective of scale. It was inadequate from also privacy. So originally, right, Bitcoin was pseudo-anonymous. But as we sort of understood the system more, it became apparent that tracing based off transactions and IDing based off amounts or sats basically can perfectly de-anonymize the entire system. So at this point, with centralized exchanges and KYC, almost every transaction and every Bitcoin has a known owner in the system. So it was really with the inspiration of the concept of electronic peer-to-peer cash and what it could do to help society juxtaposed against the maybe technological insufficiencies of the original Bitcoin implementation, as well as sort of the balkanization of the Bitcoin community after 2017 around not really changing or evolving the system in a meaningful way, which was really the catalyst for, why, I wanted to start Quai to really address some of the shortcomings.
So just to drive one piece home that you mentioned that I think needs to be added explicitly is that some fraction of our existing problems, perhaps a very large fraction, are rooted in the simple fact of the corruption of our monetary form. Yeah. And so rather than trying to play whack-a-mole with them, if we can simply get rid of that corrupt monetary form, then those will begin to heal automatically. Then we can deal with problems that are in fact just novel problems that we have to deal with. So this is important. And then the next is you begin walking down a variety of different characteristics of Bitcoin. And I should point out, by the way, there's at least 3, let's say, modes even to look at. So one would be at the level of pure code, like the architecture and design, what its strengths and weaknesses are. Oh, by the way, we can definitely, we will all officially pay homage to Satoshi. And there's no question that we live in a world that is radically different as a consequence of what he and that small group of Bitcoin developers at the very beginning did. I know because I actually was endeavoring to do something in the category of digital cash through 3 different companies and failed consistently. So to have succeeded at all and to have succeeded in a fashion which is clearly quite significant is tremendous. All right, so we're not nitpicking at all in that dimension. We're now in the in the post Bitcoin event, all right, let's now take this thing to the next level. What are the things that are left undone? So one is at the level of pure code. And so as you talked about things like the underlying way that proof of work operates, in Bitcoin in particular, produces bad results in terms of transaction speed and finalization, et cetera, which are all going to affect the second category, which is something like the path dependency, the way that it actually accumulates its being over time. And let me just expand a little bit on that idea, because I'm not sure this is clear to everybody. You can think about something like Bitcoin. This is true of anything, by the way, but Bitcoin in specific, as something. The metaphor of embryonic is not bad. So it's initiated ab nihilo with a very small amount of what it is, which is effectively going to be its genetic code. In this case, it was software. And what it has is it has a series of recursive possibilities of attracting more capability to it. So the story, the paper, the initial code base attracted, a handful of developers, and now it became a more embodied reality. There were more people putting their time and energy against producing it, which built more software, which built more realization, which also spread the conversation, which brought in more people. And then you have a series of events, right? You have buying Bitcoin with a pizza. You have selling llama socks. You have, fill in the blank. You have the building of the first exchange. And so you have this process, and this process almost breathes in and out, which is the developmental process of a biological organism, has that, these transitions. And through waves, what Bitcoin is changes, right? It is not now what it was 10 years ago, because it's gone through a developmental path. And as it does that, certain things that were potential 10 years ago have been foreclosed. They're no longer potential because of the path that it's taken. And certain things that were potential have been fully actualized, and new potentials have been opened up. And so, for example, the technical choices, and particularly the technical choices of going with blocks that were not able to carry a large amount of information. So the kind of the great block size war, which caused the first major fork, created a path dependent arc that led us into a form of Bitcoin, which is hyper parasitic on global finance as a purely abstract store of value, which is a virtue in some ways, in the sense that it pegs Bitcoin on its ability to have number go up as measured in fiat dollars. And that's like sort of like the optimization that it's increasingly oriented towards. This has negatives in at least two senses, and I'll get to the third mode in a second, which is it decreases its facility and capacity to actually serve as money. Right? So it's increasingly becoming pure digital gold in the strong sense of saying, hey, there's some small number of agents around the planet who hold this, and they do periodic bulk settlements. And then there's some other cloud of functions that have to exist to actually satisfy other elements of money. And the cultural conflicts over time eroded that subset of people who are participating in Bitcoin who are interested in it as money, and they evaporated out from BTC and either went into other versions of Bitcoin or starting entirely new structures, like yourself, for example. And the culture that is now present and operating and participating in Bitcoin is sort of narrower and more focused on sort of this laser eyes sailor, let's have the number get to 1 million in fiat dollars. But it's not at all clear to me. In fact, I would just make the strong argument that that culture and those technologies are bound to parasitism, that they actually have undermined the ability of Bitcoin as a collective intelligence, right? As something that includes a culture of humans using technologies to do things, has undermined the ability of that collective intelligence to support itself, to become autopoietic, that it can't build an economy that is functional. It can only steal market share from fiat until that's done, at which point it's not clear what happens next. So let's talk then about the set of things that you focused on, why you thought a certain set of elements was appropriate to focus on with Quai at the technical level. And then maybe we can even hypothesize about what that means in terms of path dependency and what it means in terms of culture, and how this story plays out over the next 3, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on the evolution of Bitcoin a little bit, which is the incentives that were set up by Satoshi were done in such a way to try to keep the system in stasis. And the larger the system became, the more participants it has, the more likely it wants to be static. It ossifies, right? So in some ways, the fact that the block size wars were lost, so to speak, is indicative that that mechanism of incentives worked. Now, unfortunately, from that, you have the most prominent people in Bitcoin, like Michael Saylor, saying that Bitcoiners are fine using Visa, MasterCard to pay for things. You shouldn't use your Bitcoin, right? Now, the only reason that that becomes concerning is when you look at the resilience of digital gold, i.e. what Bitcoin is right now, it is not sufficient to displace the incumbent power structures that exist. And we can see that because, BlackRock is now holding, several percentage points of Bitcoin. Michael Saylor is holding several percentage points of Bitcoin. Coinbase is probably holding, 20% of Bitcoin, right? So because the nature of what it has become, it is no longer decentralized, or it's becoming less decentralized. And the people that have the Bitcoin and are the power players in the system are more and more they're consolidating, and they're being represented by the incumbents from the previous system. And that is an outcome of it being what it is today. So that actually informs then, if we look at something as digital gold, where it's just held by a few people and very infrequently traded, as being co-optable by the incumbent power structures, what does a system need to look like that would not easily be co-opted by the existing power structures, thus achieving long-term sustainability and decentralization, right?
Let me just hammer a few points home there. So, because the question might arise, which is, other than the merely aesthetic, why do we actually care about not being captured by the existing power structures? And we have to go back to our more fundamental argument to be able to answer that properly. We can say this something like, because the existing power structures developed on the landscape of fiat, we can say a number of things about their character, about what their capacity is to perceive and operate in reality. Right? They're optimized for certain kinds of time horizons, certain kinds of behavior, which is to say, they're parasitic. We do not currently have an operating financial system which is generatively engaging in a autopoietic environment. And this is very important for us to recognize. If we actually had extremely functional existing structures that were autopoietically generative, then migrating them to a different physical substrate might be non-controversial. That might even be awesome, right? Say, hey, we have a really effective journalism system. We're going to move that journalism system to digital, and it'll just be more effective and faster. Hooray! But if you actually have a hyper corrupt journalism system and you migrate that to a digital environment, now it gets a lot better at psyops. That's a bad trajectory. And so, since we know, and of course, the point of Bitcoin, if we look at the block, right, it was entered into the environment with at least a meaningful degree of recognition of the corruption of the financial system and the coupling of the governing system, the financial system, in that corruption. the fact that a parasitic financial environment dominated by peak predators are the ones that are currently in the process of migrating over to the new digital substrate is a bad thing. Let's just say very simple, and necessary to be avoided, because these structures are not only not going to be able to address any of the problems that we're facing collectively, but are all actually complicit in making them worse. They can't help but operate in a relatively short-term, relatively selfish, balkanized fashion, increasingly balkanized. I can extend that argument at length if it's not clear. So the point is, I'm just expanding on the point that you put in brackets. The current structure of Bitcoin is highly capturable, and in fact is self-evidently capturable by a set of kinds of organisms, human social organisms. And this set of organisms are bad and will lead to collapse, ultimately parasites. And so we need to look at a design that doesn't have those characteristics. And you mentioned decentralization as a critical element, that an adequate design must be able to maintain a minimal viable level of decentralization so as to avoid the kinds, both the kinds of capture and the niches that produce the kinds of social organisms that thrive on capturing such critical elements of our coordination structure.
Right. And I think the most informative point is actually the moniker digital gold. I think that is actually a message of failure than success, because we've recognized that there have been many times in history where we've operated on a gold or bimetallic standard. We look at the first half of the 19th century in the United States. We were perfectly happy prior to the Civil War operating on sound money, but it was properties of sound money, i.e. difficulties in storage, transport, and verification, that led to the proliferation of nodes and our acceptance of the proliferation of nodes. So then if you say, okay, well, Bitcoin is the system that can't be inflated, much like gold. However, it's costly to store and use, like gold. Why would we not think that the same people that got us to use notes would not play the exact same games on Bitcoin to give us effectively the exact same outcome over time? Right? And you can already see that we have custodianship of Bitcoin and then Bitcoin trading against accounts. There's been examples already with Coinbase and IBIT where it appears there have been non-equivalent flows, i.e. there's effectively been paper Bitcoin to some degree, right? You've gotten the derivatives created. And then most perniciously in the digital age, right, the implementation of KYC AML rules are effectively making what was a permissionless self-sovereign money system more and more a permissioned money system, because if you want to use it at these broker points or these points of exchange, you're required to go through that process. So it actually then becomes an organ of a panopticon rather than something to defeat it. So it's almost self-evident when you look at the gold analogy to me that Bitcoin is on that same path, and without significantly changing it such that we recognize the shortcomings of gold and seeing those analogous shortcomings in Bitcoin, that we formulate a strategy, a game in which the same parties that co-opted gold that are now co-opting Bitcoin don't succeed, right? And that's really the fundamental question. Now, part of that answer involves this word decentralization. And decentralization is a very sort of fickle word, right? It's very hard to describe, but yet we somehow have this sort of subjective understanding that it means maybe like nobody controls the system, many participants are involved. But underlying decentralization, if we're really getting to try to make a point is, how difficult is it for somebody to singularly attack and co-opt the system? That's like what decentralization is trying to say, is that it's very difficult to do that. So we can actually start to quantify what that would cost given different attack vectors, given certain systems, and then we can modify the system construction to make those attack vectors more difficult. So classically, when we talk about sort of decentralization in the Bitcoin context, people might think how many nodes are running, right? But there's this interesting concept that I think about with the number of nodes, which is not how many nodes are running, but how many systemically important nodes are running. So there's something like 20,000 syncs of nodes in the Bitcoin network, but I could probably shut off all but 200 of those nodes and nobody would notice. Right. So there's only maybe 200 systemically important nodes. Mm-hmm. Those are the Coinbase and Krakens and Binances of the world. Those are your blockchain.coms. Those are your RPC providers. Those are your miners like your Mara and your Via BTC. Those are the systemically important nodes, because when you're running a node in this system in a P2P network, you can actually define, if you're familiar with early P2P systems, there's this concept of seeding and leeching. And basically, this goes back to sort of file sharing. The idea was that if you're a seed, it means that you're uploading more than you're downloading. So you're providing more back to the network than you're taking. And a leech is someone who's maybe only downloading and not uploading, or they're downloading more than they're uploading, so they're taking more than they're giving back.
Yep.
Right. And when I look at those 20,000 nodes, effectively all but those 200s are leeches, and the 200 are the seeds, right? So you could argue, oh, well, there's resilience in the 20,000 nodes, but the only thing that they're providing is one more copy of the ledger. And the question is, what is the marginal value of one more copy over, 200 that are needed, right?
Right.
And you have to realize that those copies come at expense too. They're not free, because sort of the fundamental limit of these systems is time, really. And making a higher number of replicates increases the time that data takes to replicate, like, very frankly. So what you want to do is you want to actually construct systems where everybody in the system is there because they are an economically incentivized participant. They're not there sort of as window decoration, sort of altruistically supporting some concept of decentralization that isn't really there. And they're providing a service back to the system. And I know this is very abstract, but we can actually get to like very concrete economic points and game theories about what the system needs to make this happen. And so this story started where? I got to wrap it back to where we started here. Decentralization. So this is sort of like a technical concept of decentralization. And in Bitcoin, we've had these arguments of, everyone can run their node on a laptop. And that's not really like a good argument. The argument needs to come back to, given this design criteria, given the game that we've set up, given the economic outcome, how much harder is the system to attack? Have I increased the cost of attacking the system? So if I go from 200 systemically important nodes to 20,000 synced nodes, but the 20,000 synced nodes don't do anything for the system because they don't raise the cost of attack, that's not like a good outcome, right? They've actually made it so that we have a negative property, which is the network is slower. It has to make more replicates. And with that, we can't have as much throughput. So when we talk about our design space, we should be talking about games that all are trying to increase the cost of attack, i.e. increase decentralization.
So I want to expand the notion of attack in because obviously, let me see. Okay, I'll take a note of this so I don't forget. Attack surface. Now we want to broaden that, because the key thing is something like who is steering what this thing is. So the simplest and the one that has been kind of like monopolizing most attention is who is steering which Bitcoin are in which wallet, right? The kind of the classic double spend attack.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only one thing that matters. We've mentioned at least two other successful attacks that have been made on Bitcoin. One was the block war. The block size war was an attack. It was a war. The word war is an appropriate language. And one group successfully attacked and steered the isthmus of this thing in one direction, which foreclosed a whole series of possibilities of what it would have or could have been, and focused and actualized a whole other series of possibilities in a fashion which is extremely meaningful for what it is and how it will continue to move forward in the future. And by the way, enriching some people and impoverishing other people, right? Value was transitioned. That's an attack. We also have seen the cultural mimetic financial attack of the MicroStrategy leveraged approach, which has been pegging the meaning of Bitcoin against number go up. Right? And it's critical to see the iterative cultural. I was around all the way back in the P2P forum conversations. And so I was monitoring and participating in the conversations of the community for a decade before it was even particularly well known. The conversation, the nature of the community, as you said, is hardened into a kind of a cult. And it's hardened into a kind of a cult that has a very narrow band of things that it can consider to be valid. The Overton window of that cult is very particular and very narrow, and very focused on number go up. So when number goes down, people just begin to drop away and become cynical. And if number go up, the cult just becomes kind of frenzied. But now I have to kind of shift to the second thing I took a note on. In order for this thing to actually be meaningful, we have to go back to our conversation, which is what we're trying to talk about here is a new form of money that acts as the centerpiece of a coordination structure for a new form of collective intelligence that can actually navigate the set of challenges that humanity faces in the 21st century. Right? That's what we're talking about. And Bitcoin currently is a parasite on top of a parasite. And so we have the fiat currency system, which is a parasite on top of the economy and on top of society, extracting value into those who've been able to game and control that system. And Bitcoin has become a kind of parasite on top of that parasite, in the sense that to the degree to which it can become the peak predator in the number go up Ponzi scheme, it is perceived as winning. And that's the only thing that it can currently see largely as what a valid strategy looks like. But the problem is that does not get you to something that can actually deliver on the requirements of being the critical piece of a new form of money that can actually be the center of a new form of coordination structure that can drive a new collective intelligence that can actually enable humanity to navigate the 21st century. In fact, quite the opposite. It makes you dumber and dumber and dumber and have a shorter and shorter and shorter time frame. So this is sort of the category critique, that there's a raison d'etre that is why this thing actually matters. There's a series of ways of seeing that raison d'etre that were heuristic. Like way back in the beginning, the libertarian impulse, the Austrian economy impulse that was saying, hey, Keynesian economics and fiat money are a catastrophe, and therefore not that, was a sort of a pseudo-adequate heuristic in the sense that it steered you in broadly the right direction. But it wasn't a strong enough heuristic because it wasn't able to fend off a series of attacks that narrowed the beingness of Bitcoin until Bitcoin actually started to become more and more the thing that you were critiquing. As you said, it becomes something like the peak predator of that kind of a parasitic system. So when we talk about things like decentralization, we're talking about it from the point of view of enough core functions have to be adequately decentralized. So enough of the functions of a monetary system, and by the way, maybe even more of a civilization stack, have to be included in the centerpiece. The centerpiece needs to be resilient to a variety of different attack vectors, including things like how the block wars were fought. So a number of different attack vectors. And this resilience has to be baked in as deeply as possible into the architecture, because of course we know that one of the key problems that we're facing is trying to use kind of democratic methods, human cultural coordination to protect something historically is exactly what doesn't work. So we talk about the choices that you guys made in terms of how mining works. What is a mining algorithm is a non-trivial choice because that has intrinsic and impossible to avoid downstream consequences of how decentralized the mining pools are and what economies they're naturally tapped into. Right? It matters that the Bitcoin mining infrastructure is a almost entirely siloed technological path. And one does not use a Bitcoin miner to do anything else in computation besides mine things like Bitcoin. By contrast, if you're using GPUs, you're actually using miners that are themselves participating in the larger economy of computation, which means there's a coupling constant there that's wired very deeply and matters because that coupling is going to cause a meta equilibrium between key pieces of the economy. And you're actually saying, hey, we're talking about something that's not operating at the level of pure fiat, which is just a pure number go up. It is actually tunneling all the way back down into that which produces energy at the bottom of the stack and maintaining the civilization structures that actually allow complex energy producing elements to really be.
Right. Yeah. So let me make one comment on the block size wars, and then I want to make a jump here in what I think is the ultimate form of decentralization. So the one comment I have is I don't think that the block size wars, in some ways, they were attacked by everybody that wanted to change Bitcoin. And the fact that the winners were the ones who changed it the least is not random. It's the fact that the incentive system of proof of work with the miners and the holders was strong, and the minimal change was most in accordance to the ossification of the protocol. So it wasn't that. So technically, everyone trying to change the system was technically attacking the system, and the system changed the least. As the result was just speaking to the fact that the incentives at scale were technically operating well.
Well, they're operating in the fashion that they had been designed, and they produced the results they produced. The metaphor here is like the castles in feudalism.
Well, so the point that stems from that, though, is proof of work blockchains and the proof of work concept is meant to ossify the system. So like part of decentralization is that the rules don't fundamentally change. That's like part of the system. Now, there's subtleties to this, which is initially when you run a proof of work system, there's some amount of time where it's a small enough system and you have enough social influence by the people that kick it off that changes can be made. Mm-hmm. But as it grows in influence and participation, those people lose their social ability to change it, and rightfully so, right? And then it becomes this thing of an economic detente where the system itself does no longer evolve, right? And so the thing is, Bitcoin's greatest strength, sort of proof of work, and this set of incentives that cause ossification was also its greatest weakness, and that it hadn't made it far enough along in the development curve prior to ossification, such that it could be the ultimate solution rather than just the first entrant.
Nice. So the analogy here is something like bullets rather than guided missiles, meaning because it has this tendency to ossify once the gun has been aimed and the trigger has been pulled. In other words, it's crossed some threshold of ossification. Its forward trajectory is now so baked in that it is a ballistic. It will be going in that direction and is not going to change path, even if it turns out it was misaimed. In fact, that's the point. If it turns out that the design was not an adequate design, then it's just going to do what it does, and it will play out its arc in a particular way, which is useful if you look at it from a high point of view. You can say, okay, no effort to steer this thing is useful, So now let's figure out what role it's going to play in the evolving ecology so that you can understand how to participate in that as almost a mechanical event.
But the ballistic property is one of the most desirable properties because that is one of the underpinning characteristics that we're saying in decentralization.
Right. It's ATP, right? Well, you don't want ATP to be changing. You want the mitochondrion to be an extremely conserved function once it actually hits minimum viable completion. So the burden is to say, okay, we have a series of what do they call it? ESS. It's not an evolutionarily stable strategy. Bitcoin, as it currently exists, and as it is ossified into, has a series of failure conditions that make it effectively terminal. So we should say, okay, that's not going to work. It's going to play out what it plays out, and in fact, it may consume the fiat economy. That's interesting, and create all kinds of other ancillary effects, which are useful to look at strategically. But in terms of the high level thing that we actually care about, it can't play that role. So then we have to say, all right, what is an actually complete set of design characteristics that produce a form of digital money that can play the role that needs to be played? Right, one, that's the design. And then second, what is the strategy or what is the path that causes that to actually begin to play, to actively actually play that role, to become actualized as such in the environment over the next, say, 10 years. And I think 10 years is reasonable in the sense that if we don't actually instantiate this new coordination structure in the next 10 years, the likelihood that we fall off some really bad cliff and radically degrade our capacity to act in the world is very high. So that's a reasonable block. Right? So that's our heuristic, but it's still a nice sort of strategic boundary.
Right. And so then the next step in terms of decentralization, so we've kind of loosely made a couple examples of technical decentralization pieces. So sort of what does it mean to be decentralized in terms of number of nodes? You've touched on how different mining algorithms have different decentralization characteristics relative to the producers of the hardware. And their availability and diversity. But there's one other thing that those technical characteristics are really trying to bootstrap that's completely non-technical, which is the ultimate form of resilience is social. So if you look at the last election cycle, and there were clearly sort of like two camps. You had Elizabeth Warren and the Senate Banking Committee kind of like extrajudicially sort of attacking and going after, banks and crypto companies, right? They were anti-crypto. And then you had Trump, who was speaking at the Bitcoin conference, right? And, I think that maybe the 30 million or so Bitcoin aware, crypto aware voters were probably very helpful in tipping the election against the anti-crypto constituent. Mm-hmm. So that is social resilience taking place through the democratic process. Now, the ultimate form of that social resilience, though, isn't voting, it's using. So if a mother is buying her groceries using a digital currency and filling up her gas tank with that digital currency, such that she is dependent on like providing for her family and her livelihood through that digital currency, if politicians try to shut that off, that is political suicide. So the ultimate degree of social resilience is the mass adoption by the population such that normal commerce becomes dependent on the system.
Can I put a meta on top of that?
Sure.
I agree, by the way. So this is very true to critical level. There's two additional elements that I think need to be put in. One is the society that adopts must be able to at least compete with and ideally outcompete the society that doesn't adopt in the short, medium term. And the society that adopts must be able to maintain something like a positive thrivability capacity in fact, will even be stronger, a positive evolvability capacity in the long term. Are those two concepts, evolvability and thrivability, legible to you right now?
Yes. But it's interesting. We've actually almost fully defined everything that the system needs to do now. Right? I mean, we haven't put the engineering numbers on it.
Yep.
But you have created the bubble, which informs the engineering numbers.
All right. Recapitulate.
Right? So
Start laying out the pieces and how they map back up to more fundamental principles.
Right. So there's two sort of evolutions in this concept of decentralization. One are a series of technical choices, but the ultimate goal is to get to the point where social resiliency takes place. And the technical choices are there to maximize the likelihood of becoming socially resilient.
Yes.
And then that is the ultimate form of decentralization, because if the way that I have to attack the system is attacking people with like violence and force, like I can't even do it with money, like now we have something that it's the ultimate level of resiliency you can have in a human society.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so you can actually say my point in a different way, which is if people are choosing to adopt something because it actually is a really good idea for them in the long term and in the immediate term, and that's true across a large portion of the population, then you have something which is that's as resilient as something can be, full stop.
Yeah. Within the construct of human society, that's as good as we can do.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
And we can say that the quality of, and it's a good idea for them, speaks to the degree to which they're participating in something that pegs the collective intelligence to which they are attached. And so they are attached to, let me think historically, Athens, not Sparta, in the post-Peloponnesian conflict, right? They're attached to something that's on an upward vector in thrivability and evolvability, and not attached to something which is ossified at a capped level of capacity. So if you've got those three pieces in place, you've got the design. Now the question is, how do those map down to a monetary system?
Right. So we've basically started to say then we need the system to work like cash, right, or like credit. We've gotten to the point that if we can say that's the ultimate social resilience is everyday use and everyday dependence at a societal scale, then one of our technical requirements is, well, what is the transaction throughput requirement and the technical characteristics of cash and credit, right? So if we look at that, you look at Visa, for example, in North America, they average 2,000 transactions per second during the year. That doesn't include MasterCard, that doesn't include Amex, and that doesn't include the Globe. I'm actually the only person who's tried to peg a number on what like TPS is needed economically. And the number that I can get to, if we kind of think of like a 4 billion person population of sort of the well enough to do internet connected kind of like world, you're looking at around 100,000 transactions per second. Okay, that's like your design goal, and then that would allow you to supplant ubiquitously the use of cash and credit in that population. So then we have to ask ourselves the properties of cash and credit. So when you do a credit card transaction, it looks pretty instantaneous. In reality, when you put your card in the terminal, it takes 5 to 8 seconds to actually say approved. When you're using the Visa MasterCard rails, so that's like a technical waypoint. It should take 5 to 8 seconds to get an approval, right? The price of that transaction is actually, pretty expensive. Sort of your base fee, depending on if it's credit or debit, is, 10 cents. And again, depending on credit or debit, it's going to be a percentage fee anywhere from 1% to 3%. So, if you could be under 10 cents for your transactions with no fee, you would be competitive. We've designed Quai at a point where we think about a penny per transaction is the competitive point with no percentage fee. So
Right.
you have like that cost point.
You can actually generalize that. If you sort of imagine a post transient steady state environment in terms of what fraction of total metabolism should be allocated to this core set of functions. And so what you're saying is something like 1%, 1 cent out of every dollar, is part of the cost of transactions, is in the zone of stability. In other words, a function that requires a larger fraction of the total energy fluxing through the environment is beginning to cost too much, which is to say that it's acting as something like a parasite, or at least like a poorly designed structure.
Correct. So there's actually like a balance here. And this in the system is probably our most poorly designed point, which is we've kind of set it so that it's going to be like a penny or half a penny for a transaction. But the ideal form of that would actually be to adjust that fee to maximize your aggregate revenue, at least to the point wherein your short-term attackability based off your security budget due to mining is great enough to like get optimality.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So of the system parameters that should be dynamic, most of them we have made dynamic, but that's the one that isn't. And so that's the one that's least optimized. But the point though is what you do want to do in the system is you want to make sure that you are trying to generate as much revenue as possible through transactions, right? And so by keeping fees low, the idea is then your transaction numbers can be very, very high, which allows you to generate enough revenue to pay for that security.
Yep.
Now, maybe, we find a half a penny isn't sufficient, it needs to go to 2 cents. You're still going to be more competitive than any other system because you're optimizing to this like ontology of a decentralized monetary structure. So even if it were to go up to 2 cents to create that optimization, that's technically okay. It's just not something we've been able to sort of properly oracleize or create a market around.
So now, I want to make sure that we're bracketing things like, what does it look like to compete in the transient environment, in the current environment, and what does it look like to actually think about optimal designs for steady state?
That's right.
And when you get to steady state, the optimal design is the balance between the overhead cost of participation in the network and the actual need to produce flows of energy to those who are securing the network, so the network is adequately secure for the amount of information that's flowing across it. And if you can find something that's able to achieve a stable but moving dynamic equilibrium between those two values, you're in exactly the right design space. In the meantime, we can say right now it's got to be below X, in order to simply get over there. And fortunately, below X is also somewhere in this box on the right hand side.
That's right.
Let's talk about the two currencies, because I have come to the conclusion that including two properly coupled currencies that satisfy store of value and medium of exchange, but are actually part of what is effectively a meta structure because they're coupled at the design level, is also at the level of necessary. In other words, it's not just a neat design, it's actually part of an intrinsic requirement for a properly complete infrastructure.
Exactly. So one of the key characteristics of blockchains is that the value is endogenously derived, at least proof of work blockchains, right? Meaning that the tokens have value because there is work put into it that correlates to energy and real cost in a computationally constrained way. And that causes the tokens to basically have value because of that costly scarcity, so to speak. Unfortunately, that creates a very unstable pricing system. It creates very volatile things. It creates something that looks like a store of value over time. You're right. Bitcoin is one of the greatest assets ever conceived up to this point in terms of its price performance. But the volatility of it has prevented people from denominating anything in it.
Right.
Right. And until you can denominate in it, it then becomes hard to actually use as a currency. Right. So the solution that the blockchain world, the crypto world, has come up with up to this point that is becoming more and more dominant are stable coins. But the key point with stable coins is that is not endogenous value. That is external value, right? So when you have USDC, you don't have any value on chain. You have a receipt, and you have a receipt for a bank deposit, or you have a receipt against something that looks like a dollar that's backed up by a treasury that's held in a bank.
Yeah.
Right. And so, there's two parts of a problem here. One is you're still on this dollar-based system. You're reinforcing the dollar, and you're also, when you hold that asset, subject to, the decay in value through inflation over time. Right. Then there's like a second part of the problems, which is that asset no longer has the properties that the proof of work blockchain assets have, which is it is going to be KYC'd, it is censorable, it is confiscatable, it is trackable, right? So that's like another disadvantage here. And then the final one is actually from a system perspective, which is if you have something like Ethereum that has a $300 billion market cap, but you have $500 billion worth of stablecoins wrapped on the Ethereum network. If Ethereum ever goes through a hard fork or ever goes through a system change, who's going to dictate the outcome? Is it the Ethereum holders, or is it the custodians of the stable tokens that run on that network?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it actually creates a huge meta attack on the consensus itself, wherein the system is no longer run in this decentralized way. And even if the system is static, it could still be susceptible to changes because of the relative value that's represented in the external assets versus the endogenous ones. Right. So
Yeah.
like very pointedly, if there was, say, a change in Ethereum that said every transaction must only happen in accordance with OFAC rules, right? This is like a very reasonable thing, right? Terrorism, financing, trafficking, whatever, right? Ultimately, the known companies that have a lot of the ETH that's doing a lot of the validating, but more importantly, all of the companies that are involved in the custodian of the stable coins that are circulating on the network are going to go with that change because they're part of the old system. And the old system is controlled by the Treasury and it's controlled by the OFAC. And if they want to participate and they want to continue working, they will follow the new rules. So you've actually given complete control of the nature of the system going forward to the incumbent players through the use of stablecoins.
Yep. So we can re-articulate this under a set of high-level principles, and the language of external and endogenous gives us the key, which is something like going all the way back. We're recognizing that some critical elements of the monetary form is that it's only governed by principles that are foundational at the level of physics. And so we don't want it to be governed by principles that are at the level of culture, for sure, right? In this case, for example, this is why proof of work is canonical. You actually have to be able to say that at the very bottom, binding something to the nature of how information and energy relate to each other at the level of physics and at the level of math is the only way to have a strong enough binding upon which to then build something that's going to have, recapitulate the stack from Big Bang to blockchain. The external endogenous distinction is to say that all of the critical elements of the system must be built on endogenous characteristics, because anything that is founded on external characteristics will ultimately become governed by the values and or interests of whatever the external characteristics happen to be. And so obviously, if we're saying, hey, we're trying to design something that is actually going to be foundational at the level of civilization, you can't have that thing. It's funny, you can actually have the image of the person sitting on the branch and sawing the branch at the base of the tree. You can't have any critical elements of that system be bound to things that are external to it, that are actually dependent upon cultural factors that are supposed to be sitting on top of it. Like if you think about it from a design point of view, that's obvious, right? It's logically necessary. So then we just say, okay, what are the characteristics that are sine qua non, right? They're design necessary. And as you said, what we realize is that medium of exchange, the people are actually using this as the coordination structure for the exchange, perception and exchange of value in a our large scale collective intelligence, is the bottom, right? A coin or the money piece, right? The piece that's acting like cash, is not an ancillary element. It is the actual more important design element of this monetary form, right? That's what it's supposed to be doing, is coordinating human beings working together. That's the critical element. And so that has to be endogenous, right? Now we sort of chain things logically together. That has to be endogenous, to the degree to which the monetary element, the stablecoin aspect, is operating in an external fashion. Then that is in fact a design failure at the category level. It is guaranteed catastrophe.
Right.
So then we see the problem that there is a store of value element that is also part of the system, and also has to be endogenous. So we now say that logically it's necessary that the system must include both a unit of account medium exchange that is stable, does not have volatility, something that against which commerce can and will naturally operate as the more fundamental element. And then you have the store of value element, which is actually acting as something like a pneumatic pressure valve, as the normal oscillations in the economy move energy back and forth in different levels of uncertainty and conviction, that has to be coupled to it inside the endogenous layer, which is inside the proof of work lock.
Yeah. No, that's a really good summary. So the piece then is you need the store value, you need the medium of exchange / unit of account, all to be inside of the system. And one of the other things that comes forth with that is that if we look at, say, the store value, and we try to sort of steelman the argument that you only need a store value, right? A Bitcoin person might say that over time Bitcoin is becoming less and less volatile, therefore we'll eventually be able to denominate all goods and services in it just like we do the dollar. And the problem that I see with that is something related to Gresham's law. And Gresham's law basically states that a superior form of money will be hoarded and an inferior form will circulate. So if we look at, and this is just sort of like rational preference of people. So if we said, you have a Bitcoin or you have a dollar and you need to buy a coffee, which one do you have a greater propensity to spend? It's usually going to be the dollar, because you have a higher, future expected value with Bitcoin. And in some ways it's going to be way more inconvenient because of the speed of Bitcoin, but just the future expected value aspect is going to prevent you from wanting to spend your Bitcoin before you spend your dollars.
So we should say that you can also say that Gresham's law has an inverse corollary, which would be something like Gresham's mandate. And that is, if you have access to a stable, high value form of money, and you can, under any circumstances, produce a weaker form of money, then you must. This is why paper currency always follows from gold. as soon as you have the ability to produce paper, Gresham's law says that's a perfectly powerful niche. Like as soon as I can say, hey, I will give you a lower value, literally, there's a niche for creating a lower value form of money in every possible circumstance. You have to fully fill that niche with something that is fully coupled. Otherwise, that niche will be filled, and you're going to constantly be reiterating the process of gold turns into paper gold.
Yep. No, that's exactly correct. And I think this is in some ways where like Austrian economics kind of like ends, is they kind of just capitulate to the fact that you will always have enterprising people creating less sound forms of money, right? So what we're saying in our system is you need the store value, but then you also need the less sound form inside of the system, so to speak, that encourages velocity, encourages transactions, encourages circulation, and with that, you generate the revenues and the fees and the money to pay for the security of the aggregate system.
Yeah, I mean, it's as far as I can tell, it's sort of self-evident. I think the language from evolutionary theory of niches is sort of perfect. You could say, hey, there is a niche for sound money, but there is a intrinsic, unavoidable niche for unsound money by Gresham's mandate. And therefore, the only metastable monetary structure is one that occupies both niches adequately to prevent anything else from competing in that space. Done.
That's correct. So then you get to the sort of manifest characteristics of Quai, right? Which is we have two tokens in the system. One of them we call Quai, and it's your more traditional deflationary store of value type token. It's account based, it's EVM compatible, so you can build smart contracts and finance on that ledger. We have a simultaneous ledger that runs that we call Qi. And Qi is what we call an energy dollar. So Qi is issued proportional to basically hash. And the production of hash is dominated by energy costs. So by issuing Qi proportional to hash, we're actually saying Qi is a reflection of energy that went into creating it.
Yep.
Right. So we have two systems, or we have the two tokens, and basically Qi then is really meant to preserve your purchasing power and create a stable reference unit of account over a 12 to 18 month time frame. Right. So you can actually write a contract or do a salary or buy goods and services with Qi. Right. The other characteristic that we added to Qi is cash-like privacy. So Qi is a UTXO based system. We do things like paynims, BIP47, as well as like 4 other tricks to kind of get you to cash-like privacy properties. Certain other, ways of going about it, ZK, bulletproof and whatnot, they don't scale. Like they're too computationally inefficient to run at the rate that you need to run for real commerce. So we kind of used all of the less mathematically intense tricks. We added a few of our own and we put them together such that you should have cash-like privacy properties with Qi.
Can I pause you there?
Yeah.
Because I think I want to do a proof. I think it's proper that that's actually, again, part of the minimum viable necessary and not just nice to have.
Privacy, 100%.
Yeah. So the proof, I think, goes to the second and third elements of the design that we've talked about, meaning evolvability and thrivability, or to say something like that which produces both an instantaneously powerful collective intelligence and produces a collective intelligence that is able to maintain itself as powerful over time. And this has to do with something like the attack surface that collapses a collective intelligence into nodes that are actually not, how do I say it right? Oh yeah, I'll put it this way. I've noticed in social media over the past decade that there are a lot of human beings who are indistinguishable from bots. meaning that it's shockingly easy to predict the output that will be produced by any given input into them. Now, there's a lot of things you can say about that, but one thing you can say about that is that they are no longer therefore adding any value to the collective intelligence. Every one that produces effectively the same output to the same input can be compressed. And so if you say that, for example, having 100 people in a collective intelligence has some kind of geometric power or leverage, each one of those 100 nodes actually has to be a unique node. If 50 of them are in fact identical, in other words, they produce the same outputs for the same inputs, you actually only have 50 nodes in your collective intelligence, which means your geometric power is actually more constrained. Now, what causes human beings to begin to behave like bots, at least one critical element is in fact the set of feedback loops that causes obfuscated preferences. In other words, if they are subject to monitoring, either panopticon monitoring by some kind of authority or social monitoring, right, normative monitoring, they will not in fact actually reveal their true preferences, which means that they are not actively giving the full value of their unique perspective and their unique values into the larger collective intelligence. Right? That's just kind of the key idea. Does that make sense?
That does. There's also maybe a simple analogy that we can draw in a competitive economy, which is if we have two burrito shops, a Chipotle and a Freebirds, and we're putting all of this data on chain, and that
somebody's
chain,
in Texas.
Yeah. We're putting all of that data on chain, right? Freebirds is going to have, trouble competing with Chipotle because each store is going to know each other's pricing. They're going to know each other's traffic. They're going to know what they're paying their employees, what they're paying their suppliers.
Yeah.
Right. So even the simple form of having economic competition requires a degree of privacy. And so,
yeah, it may actually be possible to make a purely ontological argument here, which is that perfect 100% transparency is the equivalent of ontological unity. In other words, you don't actually have two minds at work. If both minds are perfectly transparent to each other, you actually have one mind. And the partitioning of minds across boundaries that make them actually separate is what enables the multiplicative effect of their coordination.
Well, it also enables greater and more efficient exploration of the total state space.
Exactly. Well, and this is the same thing, right? It's only because you actually have multiple minds that you get the geometric consequence of their coordination, if you can coordinate them, which then enables a vastly larger exploration of the total state space. So again, we've now achieved something which is at the geometric level. Like if you don't have something like privacy, then you don't have something like multiplicity of mind. Then you don't have a geometric coordination structure. Then you've actually completely extinguished this as a valid approach. So you have to have something like privacy. You've implemented privacy in a particular fashion that enables privacy to be happening at a certain layer. It's baked in at a particular architecturally, and it satisfies certain kinds of privacy. A much larger conversation to say if it is that's an optimal design, but certainly something in that box is now provably necessary. It's not just a fun design criteria. It is at the level of civilizationally fundamental, actually cosmologically fundamental.
And there's one other piece of that's maybe just another analogy that is somewhat, I think, worth discussing, which is the Canadian truckers. So I don't know if you paid attention to that whole ordeal.
It's fair to say that I pay attention to everything. And so in this case, yes, I absolutely do. Very closely.
For the audience that's not familiar, the Canadian truckers basically were mandated by the Canadian government to get the COVID shots. And independent of your opinion on the COVID shots, they were basically still experimental. And truckers worked alone, and they're like, we don't want to get COVID shots. So at the most fundamental level of bodily autonomy, these truckers used the First Amendment, or this is in Canada, so they don't have this, unfortunately, but They used free speech to protest and petition their government in a peaceful manner by going to, I think it's Ottawa, or right, and parking their trucks and camping out and honking their horns and saying, we don't want this COVID shot mandate. And the Canadian government declared a national emergency, started arresting everybody, confiscating their trucks and their bank accounts. But most perniciously, they froze bank accounts of people that donated $20 to the truckers.
Yep.
So you can't really have a civil society without free speech. And part of free speech is the expression through donations and commerce. So I think it's, in a concrete way, fundamental to having a free society.
Yep. I mean, from my point of view, that what you just said is true, logically downstream of the more fundamental principle, but nicely colorable, like completely correct. Like you say, hey, you're making the argument you can't have civil society without free speech. For example, you can't actually explore the state space of possible political decisions if you don't actually have multiple different points of view communicating with each other in the operating environment. And an environment that is ultimately governed by a narrower perspective on reality will fail compared to an environment that has access to a larger perspective on reality, particularly in novelty space. Obviously, if the solutions are completely understood, you don't need a diversity of perspectives, but you tend not to get them. In novelty space, you will have a diversity of perspectives, and you absolutely need them. And so a society that forecloses that capacity is a suicidal society. In other words, it will collapse or kill itself in a relatively short, finite time, but certainly in a finite time. Ergo. And then the second piece is, and money, as it turns out, is more central than most people seem to believe. In fact, we're arguing it is, in fact, potentially the central element of anything that at least is governed by humans. And so a money form that is able to be used to prohibit free speech will be a key lever, and will therefore aid in the self-termination of such a civil society. Completely agree.
I just want to add too, that's an example of it terminating free speech, the corruption of the money and how the money can flow and through government in sort of arbitrary ways can actually also distort the signal in a positive manner, right? So like if you look at USAID or you look at things that are happening in Minnesota, that loop is feeding back to via NGOs and whatnot, to politics, to media, to messaging. So not only can you squelch the signal, but with sufficiently abstract, manipulatable money, you can amplify the noise over the signal.
Yep. Great. So what else? Let's talk about other designs. We can work.
So just put a cap on the two tokens then, right?
Yeah.
The point then of the two tokens is that's the minimally viable number of tokens that's needed to fulfill the characteristics of a monetary system, having a store of value, a unit of account, and a medium of exchange that are all endogenous to the system. And with that as well, that is the mechanism by which you can create sufficient revenue through having a system that encourages velocity, thus creating revenue to secure the chain self-sufficiently in perpetuity without having inflation. So this is also the mechanism by which you take all proof of work systems up to this point are putting out more energy than their revenue they're taking in. So no system has actually reached a sustainable point.
Right.
But by having two tokens and having one that is cash-like, both in its privacy properties as well as value, that gives you the opportunity to have enough revenue to actually self-sustain the system.
Yeah, let me recapitulate that point from the bigger picture, because I'm not sure that we've done that clearly, adequately, and not on camera. So the basic idea is this. We're trying to talk about something which is a an actually metastable kind of civilization. And we're talking about the monetary form as being central to the coordination structure that enables and supports that, which means that the monetary form has to have the capacity to produce a coordination structure that produces all of the other elements of the civilization stack that underlie the civilization and the monetary form. So if the monetary form we're dealing with doesn't actually produce food, doesn't actually produce roads, doesn't actually produce military defense, doesn't actually produce medicine, doesn't actually produce human beings that produce more human beings, that produce computers that can produce miners, right? If it doesn't actually have the ability to constitute 100% of the entire social economic infrastructure that is its underlying embodiment, then it hasn't actually closed the loop. And what we are looking at is that Bitcoin right now, for example, is not participating in some sense at all in that larger problem. And because of the various architectural issues and the path dependent developmental consequences that are locked in, can't. And so it can't actually produce a civil society that will produce Bitcoin or reproduce Bitcoin under element. And one of the reasons, as we described, is that in order to produce and govern a civil society, you have to have a medium of exchange, which is more fundamental, which is mediating economic activity, orienting people towards the more valuable things by price discovery, and coordinating people into local groups that are finding maximum value of price discovery, cross-product division of labor, so as to produce things like mining, and I mean physically mining, the components to produce miners and building miners. And Bitcoin is completely now dependent upon an external medium of exchange. And because it's dependent upon an external medium of exchange as opposed to an endogenous medium of exchange, it will collapse on the basis of that attack surface. For example, that's sort of recapitulating the argument from sort of core principles all the way up. Are there other elements of the Quai design that are at the fundamental level that we haven't articulated yet or discussed?
Yeah. So when we look at all of these systems in these very abstract forms, if you can't fundamentally get to the technical sufficiency, they're all just proof of concepts, right? So the sort of genesis of Quai was, how do you create a proof of work system that is technologically sufficient to meet all of the requirements that we've now defined to operate as money in society, right? So to do that, and maybe I can share a screen for this one just because it's a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Let's see here. There we are. So can you guys see this?
Yeah.
So this is a hierarchy of merge mined blockchains. So really the genesis of the idea of Quai was something we called block reduce, which is basically using proof of work in almost a recursive manner to allow shards and subnets to form, while still maintaining a unified dominant strategy, incentive compatible consensus layer that is proof of work. So if we kind of look at this animation, let me see here. I think, yeah, you can see there's like 3 layers. There's 4 layers actually. But these 3 top layers, we have what we call a prime, then we have regions, and then we have zones. And prime, region, and zone are blockchains, but they're a hierarchy of blockchains. And then below the chains, we have what we call work shares, which are all these little blocks at the very bottom. But basically what we're doing is we're using this concept of merge mining to recursively create that hierarchy. So when a miner mines a block in Quai, they're actually proposing sort of a multi-chain header that can potentially become a valid block, not just in a zone, but also in region and prime. And then depending on the difficulty that they achieve, that will become one or more of those types of blocks. So when you're mining a block using proof of work, you say have a threshold, and that threshold very generally is just saying you have a certain number of leading zeros, and we can call those zeros bits, right? So in this system, let's say the zone difficulty is 20 bits, or the zone threshold is 20 bits. The region threshold would be 20, say 5 bits, and then the prime threshold would be 30 bits. So then when you're mining, when you find a zone block, 1 out of every 2 to the 5th times you find a zone block, it will coincidentally also be a region block. And 1 out of every 2 to the 10 times you find a zone block, you will also then find a prime block. So these blocks in the higher level chains are just natural statistic consequences of mining. And what fundamentally then happens when you mine a block in multiple chains, it's the same hash, right? It's because it's one block. And that then means all of these chains have hash linked references amongst themselves, which then allows us to reference all of the chains to each other eventually, right? So this is the mechanism by which you can horizontally scale blockchain in a way that you can accommodate global commerce. So this is one sort of piece that we put together to sort of achieve scaling of proof of work.
Yeah, and this is a novel, and in some sense, natural consequence of Poem.
Oh no! So that's interesting. Poem actually came after the hierarchy.
Oh,
So the hierarchy itself, we ideated and worked on and implemented. And then the problem that we came to is how do we pick the leader, right? Who's leading the system? And we were originally thinking kind of like prime is the leader, but in reality, the zones have to be the leaders. And so the problem with proof of work is that it is indeterminate much of the time.
Yep.
So if I'm mining Bitcoin, if a block is mined, it has to broadcast through the network. It has to propagate. And during that propagation time, someone else could also mine a Bitcoin block. And now there's 2 Bitcoin blocks in the network, but they have equal weight, so they have equal preference. So then the network for the next statistically 10 minutes doesn't know what it's supposed to do, because half the network thinks block A is the canonical block, and half the network thinks block B is the canonical block. And until the next block after that is found, we can't resolve our conflict. So what Poem does is, instead of being indeterminate, we make it determinate. So it's what we actually call a causally invariant rule. So instead of just saying we're going to weigh the block based off the threshold value, we actually assign it sort of the total bit reduction of the block. So if you sort of achieve a better block, that block then has that weight than just the threshold. So in the scenario where I said you have 20 leading zeros, if you found a block with 20 leading zeros, but I found a block with 23, the 23 leading zeros is better than the 20, right? It has a heavier weight in the system. And we extend it a little bit further than that and actually say it's not just about the leading zeros, it's kind of about the fractional zeros that also exist, right? Sort of after the leading zeros. Because if we both found 23 leading zeros, but my number is still lower than yours, I should get some partial credit for a zero, right? And so very specifically, we're just kind of taking the binary log of the hash, which is a representation of the bits of reduction. But the binary log has the uniqueness of a hash. And so if you know how hash functions work, it's basically impossible to ever have equivalent hashes for 2 different inputs. So that means that we'll never get 2 blocks that are preferenced or weighed the same in the system. And thus, we can always say that when a block is produced, we will always make the same choice regardless of the time at which we saw it. So if we go back to the Bitcoin scenario and we say block A and B are circulating, one of those 2 blocks will necessarily be better than the other, and everybody will pick the better block when they see it.
Yep. So I don't think I want to crack open a deep dive into things like poem. I'll just posit the conclusion that I drew from digging into it, and then I'm going to ask you a question about the hierarchy, and merge mining. Um, so, for purposes of the argument, the conclusion that I drew is that poem is categorically more fundamental than proof of work in the way that proof of work matters. So, according to the characteristics that make proof of work fundamental, poem is categorically more fundamental. It may be theoretically the most fundamental, by the way, but I have not yet been able to prove that. It's maybe above my pay grade. And interestingly enough, it also unlocks the ability to do things like produce transaction per second at the level that enables you to have money. And I'm going to ask you a question. Maybe we need to get to in a little bit about smart contracts, while still sitting on top of a proof of work or an energy information binding agent that is foundational. So that's all just the conclusion that I have drawn based upon my research of poem.
I think we should define poem too. It
Sure,
stands for
go ahead.
proof of entropy minima, and the reason that it seems to be very fundamental is that, as we've been talking about energy and energy in systems, all going back to the Big Bang here. Entropy is sort of the key story of thermodynamics, right? It's the key story of energy and how every ordered system is constructed. So the fact that we are literally measuring, in this case, Shannon entropy, as the mechanism to coordinate consensus, and it seems to be the only way to scalably do it in a spatially diverse environment, seems like we have unlocked part of the reason that Steph is coordinating this call is because Stephen Wolfram is an advisor to Quai, and the reason that Stephen Wolfram is an advisor to Quai is because this use of entropy and this type of causally invariant multi-way graph is very directly analogous to his theory of physics, of everything in physics. So
that's nice because
everything has collapsed onto itself.
If I look at kind of like if I look at division of labor, the set of people for whom it is not above their pay grade to inquire as to the categorical fundamentalness of something like poem, Stephen is one of the very few people for whom that seems to be the reason why he's here. So it's nice because it's definitely above my pay grade. So then I want to kind of fork to make sure we're covering the whole space, and then maybe move on to the last topic. So when I've looked at the what you guys are doing, the two other pieces that struck me as being potentially fundamental, in other words, they're part of the minimum viable, that appear to be part of your design. One was the particular hash or mining algorithm, like the way that your choice of how mining works, and the way that implies the path dependency of what the mining infrastructure looks like. Certainly is not arbitrary, and I think it actually may be at the level of fundamental. That's my proposition, but I'm not sure. But I think it may be. It's certainly important. And then the next one, which I also have a vague sense about, is that some amount of ability to do what has become colloquially called smart contracts in the endogenous system, more specifically, more than what's available with things like inscriptions on Bitcoin. Maybe not as much as is available on a sharded Ethereum network, but some amount is also strictly necessary. So do you want to speak to either of those two?
Yeah. So in terms of the hash algorithm, I don't think it's fundamental. I think it speaks to there's an effect on path dependency, and there's effect on what the decentralization, the technical decentralization characteristics look like in the long term.
Yep.
Right. So, and I don't think there's like an absolutism here. We started with GPU only mining. And the reason for that is economically, because GPUs are used for other things, it makes the producers of GPUs ambivalent to the, it makes the GPU market ambivalent to the percentage that goes to proof of work mining, and thus it makes it ideally a competitive market of participants. So then you'll get a large diverse set of people that will enter and exit the system, and no one will singularly control all of the hash rate, right? Wherein if you look at ASICs, there's basically 3 ASIC producers at this point, but because they are ASICs, they are singularly focused on the process of mining and nothing else.
Yep.
So the number of people that participate is not as large as the number of people that could participate with something like GPUs. Now, there is a counterbalance to this, which is ASICs provide a form of effectively staked capital, which instantaneously raises the attack cost on the system. So it actually gives you a slightly better short-term characteristic, but potentially a worse long-term characteristic, and thus making the choice non-fundamental, but really trying to optimize the path dependency to adoption.
Right. So the argument that I would make is that because of the ossifying elements that are intrinsic to a proof of work environment, the set of choices that you make to thread the needle between the short term and the long term are right on the periphery of fundamental, meaning that you've got only a small number of bites at the apple before you've locked in. And if you locked in something that kills you in the short term, you're dead. But if you lock in something that kills you in the long term, you're still dead. It just takes a while to figure it out.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And so
what
this
you
is
say is that the way that the miner ecology forms is critical and needs to be thought through thoroughly. Let's just put it that way. And so let's then move to the smart contracting piece of it.
So on the smart contracting piece, the reason that you need smart contracts is if you don't create sufficient expressiveness, you end up creating openings for custodial counterparties. That's fundamentally why you need smart contracting. Because if you said, I am only going to create a money system, I'm going to create an asset-based rather than debt-based form of money, only Chi exists, and Chi is cash-like and nothing else. What will end up happening, because finance is actually a required tool to efficiently optimize the economy, if I don't have smart contracts, if I don't have a mechanism where I can wrap and link Chi into that system, I will end up with counterparties that do it, which is antithetical to the goal of self-custodian use of the money and decentralization, and not having large entities be the primary custodians.
So where you guys have settled, and part of this, of course, is simply constrained by things like TPS. What is the horizon of what's inside the kind of smart contracting use cases that you are architecturally designed for, and what's outside?
So Quai is EVM compatible. So pretty much anything you can do on Ethereum, you can do on Quai. And being Turing complete, that means you can do any computation, right? How efficiently you can do it, that's another question, but you could do any computation that's desired. Yeah.
So you'll get something like that set of functions that require a high throughput will have to live in an adjacent system. And you'll have what's the right way of describing it? Not filtered, a settling, like a settling tank, where the most critical elements cross product, the ones that can actually be executed on at the throughput that's available, will be sitting in the direct adjacency by something like an inverse Cantillon, or no, an actual Cantillon effect.
Yeah, so I don't actually see. So when you design like a smart contracting system, um, you definitely don't want to use this like for play to earn games where like an action in a game is going to get recorded on chain. That's
Yep.
not the point. I would argue that there's no use for play to earn games. There's no use to record things like actions in a video game on a blockchain in perpetuity, because the coordination cost, writing, and storage is way higher than the value that you're returning, right? So it's not an economically viable use case. In well-designed systems, what you're doing is you're trying to foliate the logic that needs to go on the blockchain to create as trustless of an environment as is required for your application. And then if you have complex logic, then to move that out, or you have large data storage to move that out into another system. And this is kind of well known in the optimization, I think, of well-designed smart contracting systems. So
Nice.
I don't think that you're highly constrained here. And there's optimizations that you can make to the VM such that it can actually run significantly faster than it already does. And because we also shard, then there's a replication of that VM in every shard, which also then gives greater throughput through parallelization, right? So I don't see that as a limit for any economically relevant activity.
Yeah, so you can say that if I kind of do the set of priorities, identity, what we call like persons that are part of the economy, which includes humans and other kinds of synthetic persons that humans bring together on the basis of agreements, and the relations that are governed by agreements between those persons, all of that sits in that layer, and that all sits inside the endogenous system.
Correct.
And once you have that, I think that's right. I think that's the complete set. That once you have that, that's the horizon of what must be inside the endogenous layer. And once you have all of that inside the endogenous layer, that is enough to build everything else on top of.
Correct.
And we should mention, by the way, like just as a hypothetical, one of the big risk factors of AI is identity falsification. And so either I can spoof you and present myself as being you and steal the consequences of your identity, or I can produce things that I attribute to you and steal the consequences of your identity, right? So I can either try to convince your wife that I'm you and have her give me your bank account number, or I can create a video that says you said these things and try to take advantage of your reputation or your authorities. And what you want, the solution to that problem, which is from an engineering point of view, very easy, is something like a proof of identity that is grounded at the level of a proof of work blockchain, so that I can always verify that you are you, and even the strongest AI can't falsify that, because obviously it's within the attack, the security of the underlying economy, the underlying proof of work blockchain.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of identity in the world of AI, I think there's a logical collapse to private keys that are potentially attached in some way to biometrics, and that's probably the only way you're going to do this.
Yep, and then the ability to do provenantial binding by cryptographically wrapping all expressions to those private keys that are tied to biometrics. And all of that is actually sitting on the inside of the endogenous layer of a proof of work blockchain. And so that's an example, like just for the larger population, an example of how we address the problem of the AI event horizon is this. And this, I think, is in fact actually not only the compact solution, it may be the only solution. So it's nice. Like it's a concrete example of why the earlier, the beginning of today's conversation and most of yesterday or last week's conversation was about the event horizon of the set of risks that our civilization is facing and how we actually need to design something which in principle can actually address them. That's an example that's pretty ready at hand.
Yeah, no, I agree with that one. And the other one that we touched on briefly at the end of our conversation last week was um, with something like chi, with a pure form of money that is more closely derived from physics than any other form of money, and thus not easily um, it's not easily corrupted. Um, but that form of money also then being a good proxy for human well-being, i.e., energy, you are changing the reward function of society in a way to not only help hopefully get humans to act in more productive contexts for the aggregate benefit of everybody, but you also then are potentially creating a reward function for AI to do the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. It creates something that may actually be an intrinsic alignment, which is nice, and at the right sort of velocity. So then the last topic, I think, is that I have long made a particular argument, and I'm going to make the argument here. And this speaks to the cultural element. So we'd spoken about the architectural elements, and now we've done so at length. We've talked about the path dependency elements and have done so at little length. But then I'd like to speak to the cultural elements, because I think that one of the big blind spots, and I think there's reasons why it was a blind spot in the initially Bitcoin, then blockchain, then crypto community, was a wrong perspective around culture, meaning for the most part, a proposition that it was irrelevant. The fact that the whole point of what they were trying to do was to render culture, in fact, human differences, irrelevant, trustlessness, pure. But what I'd say is that if we look back at now what is a solid, half a generation or almost a full generation, there's almost a whole human generation that is born post Bitcoin. That what we see is that trying to build something at this level, something this fundamental, using a culture that was largely, frankly, dominated by a mixture of ideologues, zealots, weirdos, and grifters, and a small smattering of autistic geniuses, got you a long way, but couldn't get you all the way. And particularly as the small smattering of autistic geniuses either checked out or got taken out, and as the culture evolved more and more towards the grifters, you got something which couldn't help but be captured by the opportunity to become an extremely effective parasite of a parasite. And that for something like Quai to navigate the strategic and operational challenges of the transient period, which again is going to be lasting for some amount of time, so that it can establish itself in the steady state as the foundation of something that survives the portal that we're in. And I can say this actually very concretely, it requires a form of individual humans that coordinate into a group that are sufficient to include the global optimum in their zone of awareness and their zone of agency. So something that is actually able to get past the Moloch downward spiral in the domain that we're operating in. So let me just kind of broaden that conceptual language. If we look at do you think of it as the 2 marshmallow experiment or the 2 cookie experiment?
Is this with the kids or?
Yeah, the kids. As it turns out, the experiment has been run with both marshmallows and cookies, and for whatever reason, our culture is divided canonically into one or the other.
Okay. I've done the 2 marshmallow experiment with my daughter. She waited for both marshmallows.
So we'll be using marshmallows in this version of the story.
Yeah.
So the Moloch problem. Are you familiar with the language of the Moloch problem?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay, great. So the basic idea is that there's a whole set of social coordination failures that are sometimes called multipolar traps, of which the prisoner's dilemma is a canonical example, where the result of the choices of the players produces a value that is lower than the global optimum. Right, so it would be better if the 2 prisoners would both choose don't defect. This is the way the game is set up. But because they can't coordinate, they both end up choosing to defect, or generally speaking, which produces a net lower value result. And the prisoner's dilemma is one of a large category that are, again, sometimes called multipolar traps. And sometime in the past, 10, 12 years ago, a gentleman named Scott Alexander wrote an essay using the ancient demon Moloch as the persona of multipolar traps. So the question is, why do we constantly find ourselves in circumstances where we can kind of all agree that X would be the right solution and that Z would be a terrible solution, and yet we always end up going in the Z direction? Why? Moloch. So he created that sort of that image. And a way of thinking about the Moloch problem is to turn it from an instantaneous coordination between two people, like the prisoner's dilemma, into a vertical in time coordination between yourself with your future self in time, of which the marshmallow test is an example. So if your daughter is given the opportunity to have a marshmallow now, or wait a little while longer and then get 2 marshmallows, she will always fail if her identity now is not able to perceive future her as a real her. Simple enough. Why would I give up my fucking marshmallow for that stranger who happens to be living in the future? That makes no sense to me. It's just a logical consequence. If you literally cannot hold identity in time adequate to include the global optimum, then the local optimum is the global optimum, and you will choose it all the time. If you have developed enough personhood that you can actually include that future state, that future version of you, both in time and in identity, right, as self, then the global optimum enters into your instantaneous calculus as a real possibility, in which case you'll choose it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I can take the marshmallow experiment as a way of articulating a vocabulary of how you surmount coordination problems, in this case, coordination problems in time with what we ordinarily see as a human. And then now I can reverse it and say the same exact problem is happening in the category of instantaneous multipolar traps. In other words, if I am able to perceive you as inside my zone of identity, in other words, I can say, hey, you and I are coordinating on building a self-organizing collective intelligence that is able to deal with the whole set of problems in the future, such that the size of that value is part of my instantaneous reality, then I will coordinate with you. And if I can't, then I won't. I will defect. Right? So what I would say is that this is a principled argument for one of the reasons why Bitcoin has been unable to navigate its problems, its trajectory adequately, is that it has not been able to form an identity that is able to actually perceive reality in time and space adequately to be able to hold the global optima inside its zone of identity. And therefore, it's been making choices that are on the long trajectory of relative local optima, for example, optimize for number go up, rather than being able to defer those relatively short-term gains in exchange for a much larger long-term gain, aka the survival of the species. And so for the collective intelligence that is gathering around Quai to be able to actually navigate the various challenges of the transient phase, which we're in now, and might in fact be rather shitty for some period of time, years, maybe many years. But in order to actually say, hey, we think we actually have something which is as fundamental as language was to the formation of culture, and it's the fundamental for being able to produce a civilization that is able to be stable and therefore will survive the next generation, we have to hold our shit together adequately with each other and through time to get to that end state. That is a quality. That is a quality of person that is necessary to get there. It requires people who are have developed the ability to survive the marshmallow test on their own, like individually, and are cultivating an ability to at least be able to understand and perceive that long-term or that global optimum through by whatever means makes sense. Right? We're doing it right now in a very abstract language, which works for us and enables me to then coordinate. I can say, okay, if the argument that we've just articulated over the past 2 sessions is true, and I think it is, then it makes a lot of sense for me to allocate significant attention, energy and attention to enabling this ecology, this technical platform and the group and the elements around it necessary to make it survive into the future, to make it actually survive and then ultimately participate in an expanding and thriving and then evolvable civilization. Obviously, for it to actually succeed, there needs to be something like a recursive increase in the number of people who attach, and they have to attach on the basis of something that is more true over time. In other words, they can't attach on the basis of something that is a temporary grift. It can't be a thing that says, hey, wow, this is great. I attach because by hypothesis, in the midterm, the grift will be revealed and they will detach and detach negatively. In other words, there'll be a blowback, which is what we've seen with all of the, I mean, you can use the degen coins as the perfect opposite example, right? A meme coin in principle can actually attach a very large amount of energy and attention. Let's just use $Trump as a perfect example, but for a very short period of time. And then when it inevitably collapses in a fashion that produces a net negative return on investment. In other words, the total cultural consequence is fuck that in a much deeper way than even the total amount of energy. So now, if you can steal that money, you might locally defect on everybody else. But the point is a civilization that's built around that process is terminal in a finite time. Does that make any sense, what I'm articulating?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's you can have the perfect system or a system which heuristically approaches optimality. However, because of inefficiencies in the communication of information, money, adoption, time, the path dependency might not get you to that result. Yeah, no.
Yeah, and I mean, we could put it in a very conventional way, which is that you need to actually be able to stay solvent. I'm putting scare quotes around that, which is to say, stay sane, rational, and committed to the end state longer than the system can be irrational.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, just to give people some context, I came up with the idea of how to do block reduce in 2018 and started working on it part-time as like a research project that was funded eventually through National Science Foundation for about 3 years. And then we worked on it for another 3 years to get a practical implementation before we launched the mainnet. So we're 7 years in before we even like launched the coin, because one of the things that we saw from the scaling wars is that you got to get a product which is close to its finish prior to launching it, because that is part of the proof of work system, right? So we're actually 8 years in now, so we are almost on a decade-long commitment to realizing this already.
And you've got probably about a solid decade to go, where a sizable portion of that time might be spent under the line, like in a serotonin and dopamine deficit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not doing this for money. I got into Bitcoin in like 2012, so that's not really an issue. I'm doing it because I have kids. I'm doing it because even if I just said, fuck all this noise, I'm going to go get myself some land and just homestead. Given a trajectory that includes the digital technologies that we currently have, there isn't land far enough away and well enough removed from like what is coming if the incumbent powers sort of win and make a CBDC. So I'm not here because this is a company. I'm here because I believe that there's an ideological fork in the road, which is either going to put humans on a very productive and free path or a very counterproductive and fascist path for a very long time. And I'm making best efforts to get us on the former rather than on the latter.
Yep. And so the people who attach themselves to this, for the most part, not for the most part, overwhelmingly will not be independently wealthy. But that's okay. because all of the things that are really awesome are actually built by people who do it in a womb. Right? They do it in, this is the whole idea of like the garage startup, right? They're doing it because it matters, because they value it on its own basis. And then they cultivate the capacity to support it inside a world. In other words, they're not exploiting it for the purposes of enabling them to do other things that are external to the environment, like buy Lambos and whatever other bullshit. Rather, they value this endogenously as something that actually matters independently, and therefore giving the time and energy they can while they are building other things in life. This is just keep them in. One language would be hobbyists, but another language would be people who actually care. And so what's nice about that is that when you encounter somebody who actually cares, you will find a feeling of solidarity and a feeling of actually things like valor, like virtue, that is unique in this day and age. We see it every once in a while, and of course the military understands this quite well. Right? If you've been in the military at any point, I guess probably ever, but certainly over the past 2 decades, you're extremely aware of the fact that you didn't do it for the money. And you're aware of the fact that other people who made those kinds of sacrifices on behalf of a greater good to protect the things that matter most are ultimately kin to you in a very particular way. So think about this as a kind of military order, right? Think about this as a kind of knighthood. And that participation will ultimately involve people who are able to operate at that level of discipline and that level of commitment to higher values, so that they can simply navigate the next decade in good working order and deliver us at the end to a beautiful result.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of those things, I don't know if we want to go into the economics of SOAP, but, one of the things that is sort of catalyzing a very positive path for us right now is SOAP. So
yeah, let's do it. So we'll put a period on the last thing I said, and then we'll just spend a little bit of time talking about something that's very tactical, and I guess it'll be time to wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah. So like you said, this is very tactical, but it's trying to address the question of path dependency, right? So basically, SOAP, which is Subsidy Open Market Acquisition Protocol, is something that we came up with and launched in December of like a month ago. And what SOAP does is it's akin to merge mining. So obviously our chain is using merge mining to very many degrees internally. And we figured out we can also do that externally. So we can actually merge mine Quai with other blockchains. But the variation on merge mining is instead of having both tokens go to the miner, we make it so that the miners just get paid in Quai, and the subsidy token, as we call it, the other chain's token reward, goes to a sort of protocol controlled address, which then sells that secondary token at market to then buy and burn Quai. So why is this an interesting setup? In proof of work systems, one thing that makes the path very hard to navigate early on is the fact that the chain is being secured by proof of work, which means miners have real electricity costs and capital costs that they need to cover on an ongoing basis, which means they will sell a lot or all of the token at market to cover the cost, which then means you need new market entrants that are at least equal to what they're selling to get the price to even stay the same or not go down, right?
Yep.
And if you want it to go up, you need even more new entrants than that every day.
Yep.
So for Bitcoin, this number is like 40 million a day. So unless there's $40 million a day in new money coming into Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin goes down. When there's more than $40 million a day, it goes up, just because of the mining. And so what we realized, though, is Bitcoin is effectively underutilizing their hash rate. Well, let me square the circle on the economics first before we go down that path. So basically, what that does for Quai when we use SOAP is instead of the miner is selling every day, they can still sell, but because we're also mining the secondary token, it's creating an equal amount of buying. So the net inflation of Quai, the net emissions, should approach zero in equilibrium. So then we can secure a proof of work network without having to have this constant downward price pressure due to the mining, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then the other consequence, there's like three consequences to this that are actually very good. You actually get better diffusion of the money in the system because the level of proof of work that you're able to sustain is much higher than if it was completely independent. So you get better churn through the economy, which actually gets better Quai token distribution. So you'll ultimately have potentially a better Gini coefficient, which will lead to something that can much more quickly be used as money. Because if something is very highly concentrated in its distribution, that concentration makes it less useful. So SOAP gets you better Gini coefficients, better distribution. It increases the amount of security you can get. And so we've been running this for a month, and I'll share a screen again. This is kind of what we call our SOAP dashboard. And so the SOAP dashboard is just tracking the chains that we're running on, which are currently Ravencoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and Dogecoin. And today we should break $1 million in subsidy revenues. So then you can see, these are the dailies. So today, last trailing 24 hours, we've done about 46,000. These are all the different blocks that we found. These are our different hash rates. We're actually, right now, because we're doing Bitcoin Cash, we're about 10% of Bitcoin Cash. We're about 50% of Ravencoin. On Script, I think we're only about 2% on Dogecoin. But this is growing kind of like exponentially because this has created a much more positive perspective on price, which again, just from that path dependency standpoint is very, very positive.
Nice.
The other thing that happens longer term with SOAP is this actually is going to enable us to trustlessly wrap the assets that we merge mine into and out of Quai. So at some point, we're going to start merge mining with Bitcoin. And as we do that, we're going to be able to create sort of a secondary consensus mechanism within the sort of EVM layer of our system, as well as a BitVM layer of Bitcoin system, so that because Quai is now in consensus, effectively referencing Bitcoin blocks, we're going to be able to trustlessly wrap Quai in and out of Bitcoin in and out of Quai. Mm-hmm. And if everything goes well, what that will mean is that at some point, people will say, I could have Bitcoin or I could have Bitcoin on Quai. And it's our opinion that most people will prefer Bitcoin on Quai. And as this grows, we should actually be able to merge mine, ideally, all of the hash rate that exists, including all of the Bitcoin hash rate, or a very high amount of it, at which point, Bitcoin as a network might not actually transact Bitcoin anymore. Bitcoin as an asset might still exist, but it will really only move on Quai.
Okay. So this isn't tactical anymore. The tactical leads up to a very interesting strategic. And to what degree is this, let me see if I can put this right. Is this an idea that anybody could have done if they had thought of it? Or is there something about the nature of Quai that makes it uniquely available?
Yeah, so there's two requirements for SOAP to work. One is that you have to have consensus that is much faster than the chain that you're merge mining with. So, we have 5-second blocks in consensus. And we're producing work shares like 1%, or it's 2 per second, roughly speaking. So our system is has beats every 500 milliseconds effectively, but Bitcoin only has, beats every 10 minutes. Litecoin is 2.5, Dogecoin's a minute, Ravencoin's a minute. So all of those systems were sufficiently faster then to enable this. If you have a much slower consensus, you're basically going to have a much higher degree of inefficiency sort of running this system, which makes it impossible to do. So if someone tried to kind of soap Quai, they wouldn't be able to do it in a decentralized way because a decentralized system can't really run much faster than Quai. So what SOAP actually says is there's a couple of consequences. One is it says that proof of work blockchains can no longer like be not compete because they have first mover advantage in a large moat in terms of capital and hash. Because anybody can come in, sort of reutilize their underutilized hash to create greater utility than they're creating with the same resource.
Yeah.
Right. And if they're doing that, then at some point that might compete at an asset level, not just a utility level. Right. So it makes proof of work a highly competitive environment rather than sort of a balkanized environment, which I think is a very cool contribution to the system because, right, if we want proof of work to succeed, having a mechanism by which you can compete on utility rather than just aggregate hash rate is super important, regardless of Quai succeeding and becoming, the ultimate token or not. So, that's like a very interesting consequence. And there was one other consequence. The uniqueness is what you were asking. So there's one other thing that you have to have, which is the multi-algo facet of the system. So there are other constructions of multi-algo that operate on blocks, but it's much more difficult to do multi-algo in a block-based setting. One of the reasons that we're able to do it is because we have work shares. And in a work share-based setting, it's much easier to create, to use multi-algos while still maintaining robust dominant strategy, incentive compatible consensus that doesn't have sort of pitfalls in terms of opening new attack surfaces or having issues with availability. So the two unique things that Quai has is that it's very fast in the proof of work space, and then it also has work shares, which allows it to operate in a multi-algo setting easily.
Well, the first point I think I get well. The second point I'm pretty sure I don't understand at all. So I'll just assume that you're telling the truth. But with regard to the first point, the thing that came up to me was the idea of OODA loops. Do you know those?
What is it?
OODA, OODA?
No, I'm not familiar.
You like this. It's one of the more fundamental, in terms of thinking fundamentally, pardon me. Sadly, I did not bring another glass of water. In terms of thinking fundamentally in the category of strategy, an American strategist named John Boyd hit perhaps the lowest level, which is called an OODA loop, and that's the observe, orient, decide, act. So that any strategic actor at the end of the day, if you can operate, you can make sense of what's happening, and you can make choices that affect the reality that you're operating in, quite often the reality that your adversary is operating in, faster than they can. If you're inside their OODA loop, that is the fundamentally most powerful strategic position to be in. Lots of ways of thinking about it, but it turns out to be a very powerful way of thinking. And in some sense, you just said that with regard to proof of work blockchains, that the proof of work blockchain that is able to operate faster than another proof of work blockchain is basically inside the other proof of work blockchain's OODA loop and can drink their milkshake in an asymmetric fashion. And since we earlier made the argument that Poem may establish the fastest truly proof of work blockchain that can be delivered, that may mean that then Poem is categorically inside the OODA loop. It's at the bottom of the strategic stack, or if you'd like, it's at the highest point in the strategic landscape. And that Poem will ultimately end up, by definition, orient everything towards the fastest, which is going to be, in this case, be Quai. That's a very powerful argument. It just dawned on me as we were just thinking about, as we were discussing it, but very intriguing to think about the implications of that. It should be encouraging over the transient time frame, which is to say that the most fundamentally sound, this is the inverse Gresham's law for blockchains, the most fundamentally sound proof of work blockchain will actually ultimately win, would be the conclusion.
From SOAP, correct. Well, and so there's one other thing that's maybe like a rough aside, but it's just us thinking about path dependencies, right? And so within SOAP, you have this sort of requirement that you are paid in Quai. And based off of how certain mining companies are set up and different things, that may have a much higher degree of resistance to adoption than is necessary. So one other aspect of SOAP is we've actually already shipped the code that allows you to also elect to actually get paid in the other token.
Yep.
And so what this does for us is if you say, I want to get paid in Bitcoin Cash rather than in Quai, we don't pay you any Quai. We're going to let you pay us like 30 bips in Bitcoin Cash, but we're effectively functioning as a pool for Bitcoin Cash at that point.
Yep.
So then what we're doing is the Quai network and all of the nodes in the Quai network become the most robust, lowest latency, highest uptime and availability pool that could possibly exist for all of the networks that we merge mine with.
Yep.
So then instead of saying you have to take Quai if you're really stuck on the other asset, we can still take advantage of the security of your hash rate and make money without having to force you to take Quai. So then we can ideally eat up all available hash rate in the world much more quickly. So that's actually the game that we're playing. It's not just getting people to mine Quai, it's getting all of the hash rate to secure our chain.
Yep. Yeah. I intuitively, I think that is in fact, again, provable. Like that may be logically necessary. I can't do the construction in real time, but I'll be chewing on it. All right. I think we've kind of covered a lot of territory. I'm certainly pretty well tapped, and I know that you're still suffering from that surgery. So want to call it?
Yeah, we can call it here. Appreciate it. This has been a great convo, a wide-ranging convo. I like how, I get specific and then you get more high level, so to speak, more fundamental in some ways, but it all seems to marry back together.
Yeah, I mean, if we can consistently do it, that's the scientific method. it should actually get us closer to truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this conversation, you've sketched an outline of at least a very informal proof of many of the things that build up to the conclusion that not only do we need something like Quai, but many of the design choices that we're making within Quai should get us there.
Yep, that's right. All right, great. Well,
cool.
I look forward to our next conversation, when and how that may come about.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jordan.